Some of you know bits and pieces of my story, just my own testimony, and we're not going to take the whole time to go through it again. But bottom line, there was a significant health crisis in my life in 2009 as a 13-year-old. Had just finished cross-country season, was in 8th grade, by all metrics, was a physically healthy 13-year-old kid. And then one Sunday morning, I collapsed while getting ready for church. Didn't pass out, just my legs literally just gave out, and I wasn't able to hold myself up. We went to the doctor. Fortunately for me, he pieced together a number of things that were going on, and he knew immediately what was going on. He didn't reveal that to us until much later, but the moment I walked in and he saw me, he knew what was happening. He just didn't tell my mother or I. He actually asked us what we thought might be happening. He just inquired if we had any clue, and he then went on to test my reflexes. He ordered a number of lab tests and blood work and all those kind of things. All those things came back negative. Then they sent me in for overnight observation. He had another doctor order more tests. And only after all of those things then were they able to accurately diagnose the problem. At that point, then he finally said the words that would then change my family's life, telling us that I had Guillain-Barré syndrome. Now, if the doctor would have just diagnosed me the moment that I walked into his office, in this particular case, technically, he would have been correct. He knew what was going on, and that would have been all right. He had a hunch, and the hunch played out. But what if the hunch was wrong? As it actually very often is with GBS. Most of the time, patients get misdiagnosed for days, weeks, maybe even months, until somebody finally pieces together what's going on. If he would have not done the pre-work, and if something else would have been going on, before diagnosing me, things could have had a very different end for me. Any doctor with any diagnosis, for that matter, if you just walk into their office and they just say, all right, well, this is what's wrong with you, and they start prescribing you medication and treatment and all the different things without doing any tests in advance, you probably are not going to trust that doctor very much. It's not the way that things get done. There's no listening, just action. Stay with me here for a second. I think spiritually, that's often how we treat people's lives. I think that's often how we approach people's spiritual life. That we jump into people's lives with answers and advice and prescriptions and spiritual conversations without ever listening to the voice of God, without ever listening to the voice of the people that we're trying to talk to. When it comes to witness and evangelism, prayer is the pre-work. It's the place that we go and we allow God to prepare paths for us, to reveal needs for us before we ever actually go and step into the place that He's leading. Prayer is a thing that should be done in preparation. Preparation for a day, preparation for a meeting, for a spiritual conversation, for a hard season ahead. Whatever it may be, prayer is preparation. Now, don't get me wrong, there's not a wrong time for us to pray. There's not a wrong time for us to pray. There's not a wrong thing for us to pray for, but prayer in its best form goes before. Because it then allows God to prepare us. It allows God to prepare the path ahead of us. Prayer is not meant to be a way for us to say, hey, God, I already did this thing, so can you bless it for me and make it all work out? It's an opportunity for us to say, God, I want you to guide my path today. I want you to be in control of my path today, so help me to follow you, lead me where you want me to be. For a few weeks here between Easter and Pentecost, we're taking some time to talk about our witness to the world. Conceptually, we all know, and I'm going to assume believe, that Jesus' life and death and resurrection are good news. These are good things that we celebrate. But so often we get told that it is our job to go and share that news, and then we freeze. We can believe all the right things, but you ask me to go and tell somebody about it, and we just freeze up. Whether it's from fear of speaking to people, or fear of not having the right answers, or fear of rejection, we allow ourselves to be overwhelmed by the thought of telling somebody else about Jesus. But what if we're making this all too hard? Last week, we talked about the difference between converters, people who simply go into a space or a relationship trying to tell and convince people with nothing but their words that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, versus blessers, people who go into the world to make it look more like the kingdom of heaven, with the intention of creating an openness to the gospel that didn't exist before because of the good actions, the blessings that they are pouring into the people around them. The example that we cited last week, blessers were significantly more effective at converting people, like 50 times more effective than just telling people about Jesus, because people are more open to having their life changed when they first see that yours already has been. When faith is more than just words, it can change lives. So, using the book called Bless by Dave Ferguson, we're now taking the next 5 weeks to talk through these Bless rhythms. Bless is an acronym, as all good things in ministry are, and so it stands for begin with prayer, listen, eat, serve, and story. Now, to be clear, this is not inherently a sequential list of steps that you must take in a specific order. This is not a step A, begin with prayer, and then step F, congratulations, somebody is a Christian type of process. Things are messy, things are fluid, things happen in different orders. You might serve someone before you ever go to listen to them. There could be an opportunity for you to share your story with somebody before you ever get to sit down at a table and share a meal with them. The point is that this is a framework, not a linear sequence of events from point A to point B. So, the one thing, though, that absolutely does have a right order for us to do it in is the very first letter, B, begin with prayer. Because this is the foundational work for everything else that follows it. If this isn't in the right spot, nothing else is going to be. Ferguson's chapter of the Blessed Book on this particular step begins with this quote. He says, I cannot change the world. You cannot change the world. Even prayer alone doesn't change the world. Only God can change the world. Beginning with prayer is not preparation for your words, for you to say the right things. It's preparation for God's work. It's alignment with the things that He is already doing and preparing ahead of you. Like I said last week, sometimes we get so in our head about our witness to others and think that we can't actually share the gospel with somebody because we're not smart enough, or we're not eloquent enough, or we don't have all the right answers for somebody. And when that's your mentality about sharing the good news, you are putting yourself in the place of God. Nothing that you say or do will ever change somebody's heart, ever. Only God changes hearts. So the question is then, will you allow yourself to be used to be a part of God's work in somebody's life? If you go into it with the mentality of, I'm going to change someone's life, it's not going to work. If you go into it with the mentality of, how can God use me to change someone's life? I won't guarantee it'll work, but at least there's a chance. Now, if God is the only one that can do the work, if we aren't actually as important in the process as we think we are, then that means that we need to depend on God's work in people's lives rather than our own as we go out to try and do His will. And the way that we do that, the way that we depend on Him, is by turning to Him, listening to his voice, trusting in his guidance and his promptings. Prayer is not just preparation for the things that you're going to say, it's preparation for what God is already doing in someone else's life. And we know that prayer is an important step in, well, honestly, any moment of our lives, but especially when it comes to witness and evangelism. We know this is an important step because Jesus himself models it constantly. The story that Bill just read, it said at the very beginning, on one of those days, Jesus went out to a mountainside to pray, and he spent the night praying with God. And then we're told, he comes down from the mountain. He chooses his 12 disciples. They all get named. Not that this is super relevant to the point of my message, but I do think it's an interesting point in the story. We're told that the disciples, we're told that Jesus spent time praying about the disciples and who they're going to be. But it says there in verse 12 that he's praying about who among the followers, or sorry, maybe that's verse 13, sorry, either way, who among the followers he should choose as his core disciples, meaning that there were other options beyond the 12. Like, we know these 12 guys, right? We know these 12 guys that ended up getting picked, but we're told it's who among his followers he should choose as his disciples. So this is not a only these 12 guys said yes, and so I'm going to pick them, and we're just going to see what happens. This was an intentional choice that he made to draw these guys out among the other followers. We're not told how many people were following Jesus at this point, but later in Luke 10, we're told a story of Jesus sending out 72 of his followers in pairs to go and do ministry. So there's not a small group of people that are following Jesus in this moment. So there were more than just the 12. But among them are the 12 disciples who were eventually singled out to be the core disciples and the leaders of the early church. But before he made that choice, before he decided the 12 guys that he's going to do life with and spend time with and pour his life into and trust them then to carry on the ministry that he's calling them to do after he goes, before he made that choice, he prayed. We don't know how long he had spent with these followers up to this point, but don't you think that there were probably some clearly best and brightest guys that were a part of that 72 that just would have made sense? Some that were just sharp dudes that you wanted to be with. Some, maybe even a dozen, that seemed to be the obvious choices for ministry. I mean, if you're starting a movement that is intended to change the world, you want to grab the cream of the crop people, right? It would be easy for me to make a joke about the hodgepodge group of misfits that Jesus chose instead, and it wouldn't be a wrong joke. By the time all is said and done, you've got a handful of fishermen, some craftsmen, a zealot, a tax collector as the core of Jesus' movement. Surely there were other people who would have made more sense, who would have gelled together a little more easily than a zealot and a tax collector would. People who had the right resume and training. But Jesus didn't want, and Jesus did not grab the people that made sense. He wanted the people that God wanted. He prayed. And it worked, didn't it? We're here, aren't we? Beginning with prayer means that we trust in God's wisdom more than our own. Beginning with prayer means that maybe we're going to make a decision that does not make a ton of sense from our standpoint. But we're going to make those decisions in faith and trust God for the outcomes. Beginning with prayer does not mean that we do less. It means that we stop doing things that God wasn't ever asking us to do in the first place. Dwight Moody was one of the most effective evangelists in American history and was at least a piece of the larger story of the Great Awakenings of the 19th century. And over the years, people would ask him what he was doing right, basically, what his strategy for ministry was, who he was learning from, what were the things that he was doing to make his ministry work. And ultimately, his strategy was prayer. Because behind the scenes of his ministry, there was a group of women that was committed to praying for him every single time he preached, which was not a small amount. Moody later said that his preaching wasn't the key of his ministry, it was their prayers that were the key of his ministry. He said that when these women weren't present, he could feel it. He was aware of their missing presence. His effectiveness wasn't just in what he said, it was in what was happening before, during, and after every single time he opened his mouth. I think often how much or how little we pray isn't an indication of how much we believe in God's ability to show up and do something powerful. I think most people, at least most Christians, would articulate that yes, prayer does something. God can do something. I think how much or how little we pray is actually more of an indication of how confident we are in our own ability to show up and do something powerful. If we've got things under control, if we are the God of our own universe, then we don't really need the God of the universe to show up and do something powerful, do we? Because I've got this. But on the other hand, if we understand that everything that we have and everything that we are and every talent that we have been given and every ability that we have worked on, all the things that we hold as a point of pride in our life, all of that is a gift. If we can understand that, then that changes everything, doesn't it? Dwight Moody was, by all accounts, a gifted, talented communicator. And I'm sure he was told as much on a very regular basis. I mean, I know how many times you all walk out and say, great job, Pastor, and I am nothing in comparison to that guy. So, he probably heard this a lot. And it would have been easy to just begin to trust in himself at some point. I've got this. I've done this 1,000 times. I don't need to pray or trust in God here. And yet he still made the intentional choice to have a group of women praying for him every single time he got up and spoke. You may not get the opportunity to get up on a stage and speak to thousands of people. And I know for some of you that is a great relief. But you have the opportunity to pour your life into someone else's. You have the ability to plant seeds or perhaps even someday bring in the harvest of someone's soul. So let me ask you then, do you trust more in your ability to change someone's life or in God's? The book of Nehemiah tells the story of the Israelites returning in multiple waves back from Babylonian exile to Jerusalem. And when the first wave arrives back in Jerusalem, the city is in ruins. The walls have fallen, the temple has been destroyed, everything's a wreck. And so the message of the ruined city makes its way all the way back then to the Israelites that are still back in Babylon and still in captivity there. And the message makes its way all the way back to this one guy, Nehemiah, who is the cupbearer to the king of Persia. And when Nehemiah hears about the destruction of the city and the disrepair that everything is in and the struggles that they're all having as they're trying to rebuild, we're told that this is his response in Nehemiah chapter 1. He said, "When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. And for some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven." His response was prayer. And yes, crying and mourning and weeping naturally, but it was prayer and fasting. Now remember, beginning with prayer is not preparation for your words, it is preparation for God's work. And he is clearly in this moment hoping that God is about to take action in some way, shape, or form. The end of his prayer at the end of chapter 1 is for success in the presence of the king. He's intending clearly to go to the king and make some request of what's going on. But notice then what happens in chapter 2. It says, in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was brought for him, I took the wine and gave it to the king. I had not been sad in his presence before, and so the king asked me, why does your face look so sad when you are not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of heart. I was very much afraid, but I said to the king, may the king live forever. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire? The king said to me, what is it that you want? And then I prayed to the God of heaven, and I answered the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city of Judah where my ancestors are buried, so that I can rebuild it. Nehemiah doesn't even have to bring it up. He doesn't have to bring it up. I believe because of the work of prayer and fasting that he had already done in advance, before he just rushed in and asked the king for help, God was using that prayer then to prepare his path, to prepare the king's heart for what was about to happen. Beginning with prayer is not preparation for your words, it is preparation and participation in God's work. God was working. Even when the king asks him, what is it that you want? He still pauses to pray for God's words and wisdom. And because Nehemiah prayed, God opened the doors. He prepared the hearts of the king and his leadership, and Nehemiah was sent home to go and to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. If that's how God works in leadership decisions and movements, then why would we think that sharing our faith should be any different? Or any part of our life should be any different? Why would we not assume that God will move if we simply turn to him and trust in him and allow space for him to do so, rather than taking it all on ourselves? So as we think about how do we bless our friends and our neighbors, how do we show good news to them, as we think about sharing the good news with our community of Jamestown at large, can we make it a little bit less about us? Our wisdom, our abilities, our perseverance. Can we instead make it about what God is wanting to do through us? You don't need to know all the right answers. You do not need to say the perfect things and to be the most articulate communicator. You don't need to force a conversation that isn't there, because changing someone's life was never your job in the first place. God is already at work in people's lives long before you show up. So the question is not, can you convince them? The question is, will you pay attention to what God's already doing? And that starts with prayer. Not as a last resort, not as a backup plan, but as the first step in the process. The most important step in the process. So what would it look like for you this week to not to go out to try and convert somebody, but to simply begin by asking God, who are you already working on? Whose heart is already being shaped and formed? Where are you already moving, and how can I join you in what you're already doing? Because when you begin with prayer, you stop carrying the weight of changing someone's life, and you start participating in what God is already doing.